When my mother-in-law locked me out on Christmas night, I didn't scream. I didn't knock again and again. I just stood there in the snow, holding the small gift I had bought for her with my trembling hands. The air was cold, but what I felt inside was colder. I could see the warm yellow light coming through the window. Behind that glass, I could hear laughter, plates clinking, Christmas music softly playing. They were all inside, my husband, my daughter, her cousins. And I was out here, outside the door of a house that was supposed to be my family's home too. That moment still lives inside me. It wasn't only about being locked out. It was about finally realizing how unwanted I had been all along. Sometimes it takes the quietest night to hear the loudest truth. My name is Anna. One married David 15 years ago. When I met his mother for the first time, she smiled politely and said, "You seem like a nice girl. Maybe too quiet for David." At that time, I didn't understand what she meant. But over the years, I realized her words weren't just a comment, they were a warning. David was her only child. She had raised him alone after her husband passed away when he was still a boy. Her whole world revolved around him. When we got married, I thought she'd be happy to see her son start a new life, but it felt like I had stolen the only thing she had left. At first, she tried to hide it with forced smiles and polite talks, but little things started showing, like when she'd criticize how I cooked, or how I dressed, or how I spoke. Nothing I did was ever good enough. I tried to be patient. I told myself, she's just protective, she'll come around. But she didn't. Every visit turned into a quiet test I could never pass. When our daughter Emily was born, I thought maybe that would melt her heart, and for a short time, it seemed to. She came often, brought gifts, took pictures, told everyone how beautiful her granddaughter was. But slowly, the same sharp tone returned. "You're too soft with her," she'd say. "Children need rules, not hugs." Sometimes she'd even take Emily out without asking. Feed her candy, I said no to. Or make small comments like, "Your mommy doesn't know how to handle you." It broke me inside. I wanted to tell David, but every time I tried, he sighed and said, "Anna, she's old. She doesn't mean it. Please, don't take it to heart." But how do you not take it to heart when the person who hurts you lives inside your heart's walls? For years, I tried to balance everything. Being a wife, a mother, and a daughter. But no matter how much I gave, something always felt missing. We lived about 30 minutes away from my mother-in-law's house, yet she called David almost every day. Sometimes, she'd cry on the phone, saying, "You've forgotten me since you got married." Other times, she'd guilt-trip him with lines like, "I'm old, David. I don't know how much time I have left." And David, kind, loving, loyal David, he always gave in. He'd visit her every weekend, sometimes staying overnight. And when I asked to come along, she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes, "Oh dear, why don't you rest at home? You must be tired from taking care of Emily." It sounded caring, but I knew what it really meant. She didn't want me there. The truth is, I never wanted to take David away from her. I just wanted a place beside him, not behind him. But his mother made sure there was no space left. Every Christmas, we had the same argument. Her house, her decorations, her rules. I loved Christmas, the smell of cookies, the sound of laughter, the warmth of family. But at her place, it was different. She made sure I never felt like part of that family. She'd rearrange the table so that I'd sit at the far end, serve everyone else first, and say little things like, "Oh, Anna, I didn't know you liked cranberry sauce. We never made that in our family." Every year, I smiled, stayed quiet, and held David's hand under the table. But even his hand began to slip away. The more she complained, the more distant he became. One night, after we came home from her place, I finally broke down. Tears wouldn't stop, and I asked him, "Why can't she just like me, David? What did I do wrong?" He rubbed his face tiredly and said, "You didn't do anything wrong, Anna. She's just lonely. Then he added softly, she lost her husband, and I'm all she has. Please try to understand. I nodded, but in my heart, something cracked, because in that one sentence, he made it clear, no matter how hard I tried, I would always come second. So I stopped complaining. I stopped fighting. I decided to be silent, to keep peace for Emily's sake. But silence doesn't fix everything. Sometimes, silence is the seed of a storm. And that storm arrived one winter evening, just a few days before Christmas. That December felt colder than usual. Snow covered everything, the streets, the cars, even the little swing in our backyard that Emily loved so much. I remember standing by the window, watching the flakes fall, and wishing for warmth, not from the weather, but from the people around me. David came home late that night, holding a box of decorations. Mom wants us to come early this year, he said, setting them down on the table. She says she's not feeling well. I hesitated. Last year had ended in tears, not mine, hers. She'd accused me of changing her son, and David had walked out to calm her down, leaving me alone at the table with her cold words echoing in my ears. Still, I smiled. Of course, I said softly. We'll be there. Inside, my heart whispered, not again. The night before Christmas Eve, I packed our bags. Emily, now 7, ran around the living room excitedly. Are we going to Grandma's house again, Mommy? Her innocent voice carried no memory of the arguments. Only joy the kind children feel before the world teaches them otherwise. Yes, sweetheart, I said, brushing her hair. We're going to Grandma's. David kissed me on the cheek. Thanks for doing this, Anna. It means a lot to me. I wanted to ask, what about what it means to me? But I didn't. I just nodded. When we arrived, the house was already glowing with lights. My mother-in-law stood at the door, wrapped in a red shawl, smiling that same thin smile. David, oh, you came, she said, hugging him tightly. Then she looked at me. You look tired, dear. The city life must be hard on you. I forced a polite laugh. It's been busy, yes. She didn't respond, just turned to Emily. There's my favorite girl. Come to Grandma. Emily ran to her, and the moment was beautiful. Until my mother-in-law said, see, she takes after David. Not a bit of you in her face. She chuckled, and everyone laughed except me. I stayed quiet, pretending it didn't sting. Dinner that night was chaos wrapped in cheer. Old relatives, Christmas carols, the smell of roasted turkey. But under the laughter was something sharp. Her little comments. Oh, Anna doesn't cook much, does she? David used to love my pies until someone put him on a diet. I laughed along, but every word felt heavier. By dessert, I excused myself and went to the porch. Snowflakes drifted under the golden porch light. For a second, I wanted to just keep walking. Away from the noise, the tension, the pretending, David came after a while. Mom didn't mean it, he said quietly. I turned to him. David, do you ever notice how I disappear in this house? He looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, I said, voice trembling. Every year I come here hoping to be seen, and every year I leave feeling smaller. He sighed. Anna, please, not tonight. That was it. 3 words that broke something inside me. Not tonight. As if my feelings were a problem that could be postponed. I went to bed early that night, and while the house was filled with laughter and clinking glasses, I lay there awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how love can feel so lonely. That night, I made a silent promise to myself. This Christmas would be the last one like this. I didn't know then how true those words would become. Because by the next evening, everything, my marriage, my peace, my family, would change forever. Christmas Day began with laughter, the kind that hides tension behind smiles. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, and the sound of wrapping paper being torn filled the living room. Emily sat by the tree, opening her gifts one by one, her little face lighting up with every surprise. For a few moments, I felt peace. Maybe this year would be different. Then my mother-in-law handed David a small box, wrapped in gold paper. He opened it carefully and smiled. Inside was an old wristwatch, his late father's. "Oh, Mom, I thought this was gone," he said, eyes glistening. She smiled proudly. "It was never gone, dear. I just wanted to make sure it stayed in the right hands." Her words hung heavy in the room. David didn't notice, but I did. The right hands. I sat there, silent, pretending to admire Emily's toy. As my heart began to sink again. Later that evening, dinner was served. The table shimmered with candles and silver plates. Everything looked perfect until her next move. "So," she began casually, "I heard Emily's school needs volunteers for the Christmas fair. I might sign up. Maybe spend some time with her while you're busy." I smiled tightly. "That would be nice." She smirked. "You wouldn't mind? I mean, some mothers don't like others stepping in." David laughed lightly. "Mom just loves Emily too much. That's all." I looked at him, waiting for him to see what was really happening. But he didn't. And then she said it. The sentence that shattered every piece of peace I had left. "You know, David," she said, her voice soft but sharp, "sometimes I wonder if Anna really understands what family means. You've changed since you married her." The room went silent. Even Emily stopped playing with her doll. I felt my throat tighten. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep calm. She gave a sweet smile. "Oh, I just meant you don't visit as often, dear. You used to be such a family man." I looked at David, hoping just once he'd defend me. But he only said, "Mom, let's not do this now." That was it. The same words again. "Not now." I stood up slowly. "I think it's time we go home," I said quietly. David frowned. "Anna, it's Christmas dinner." "Yes," I said, holding back tears. "And I'd like to spend it somewhere I feel welcome." My mother-in-law gasped softly. "You're overreacting." I turned to her. "No, I've been underreacting for years." The room froze. Even the ticking clock seemed to stop. David stood up, his face pale. "Anna, please." But I was already walking toward the door. Emily looked confused. "Mommy, are we going?" I knelt down, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Yes, baby. We're just going home." I picked up my coat and walked out into the snow. The cold air hit my face, sharp and clean, like the first breath after holding it too long. David didn't follow immediately. I could hear voices behind me, low, tense. Then the door closed. He came after a few minutes, eyes full of guilt. "Anna, you shouldn't have left like that." I turned to him, voice trembling. "And you shouldn't have let her humiliate me like that." He sighed. "She didn't mean it." I shook my head, tears spilling down. "No, David. She meant every word. You just refused to see it." For a long moment, we stood in silence under the falling snow. Two people married by love, separated by denial. Then he whispered, "Let's just go home." I nodded, but deep inside, something had already ended that night. Not our marriage, not yet. But the part of me that still hoped she'd ever accept me. The drive home that night was quiet. The roads were covered in snow, glowing softly under the streetlights. Emily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her little hands clutching her new doll. David kept his eyes on the road. Both of us pretending the silence wasn't screaming between us. When we reached home, I gently carried Emily to bed. She stirred a little and whispered, "Is Grandma mad at you, Mommy?" My throat tightened. I brushed her hair aside and whispered, "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups just forget how to be kind." I closed her door softly and stood there for a moment, listening to her slow, steady breathing. It was the only peaceful sound in the house that night. David was sitting on the couch, his tie loosened, his face tired. He looked up when I entered, but didn't speak. Finally, he said, "You made things harder than they needed to be." I felt something inside me break quietly. Harder, I asked. David, I have been swallowing my pride for years. I smile when she ignores me. I nod when she insults me. And I sit at her table like a guest in my own family. And you call that making things harder? He sighed, rubbing his temples. She's old, Anna. You know how she is. She doesn't mean harm. I wanted to scream, but instead, I just sat down slowly. I think the problem isn't that she's old, I said softly. It's that you still treat me like I'm the outsider. He didn't answer. The silence told me everything. The days that followed were heavy. David spoke less and less, and when he did, it was short, distracted, polite. He spent more time at work. I spent more time pretending everything was fine. Emily, in her innocent way, tried to fill the gaps between us. She'd bring drawings to the table and say, "Look, Mommy and Daddy are holding hands." I'd smile, but it hurt, because even she could feel the distance. One afternoon, I was cleaning the living room when I found David's phone buzzing on the table. It was a message from his mother. It read, "I told you she'd make a scene. You deserve peace, son. You don't need to keep sacrificing for her feelings." My hands trembled as I read it again and again. Peace. That's what she called it, breaking me down slowly, year by year. David walked in just then, and I held up the phone. "She texted you again," I said quietly. He looked startled, then defensive. "Anna, you shouldn't be reading my messages." I nodded slowly. "You're right," I whispered. "I shouldn't have to." He hesitated, guilt flickering in his eyes. "She just worries about me." "Does she ever worry about me?" I asked. He didn't reply. That night, I sat alone by the kitchen window, watching snow fall again. The world quiet, untouched, almost peaceful. I thought about all the Christmases we'd spent together, and how every year I'd hoped it would be different. But hope, I realized, can be heavy when it's one-sided. I started writing a letter, not to David, but to myself. It said, "You've tried, you've loved, you've stayed kind, and none of it was wasted. But now, it's time to stop begging for space in someone else's heart." I folded the letter and placed it in my dresser drawer. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. It happened 2 weeks after that Christmas night. David said he wanted to visit his mother again, just to clear things up. I didn't want to go, but Emily begged. "Please, Mommy, Grandma promised to make cookies with me." So, I agreed. I told myself maybe this time, we'd keep things civil. Maybe we'd act like a family, just for Emily's sake. The snow had melted, but the air still carried the bite of winter. When we arrived, my mother-in-law opened the door with her usual practiced smile. "Anna," she said politely, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I'm just here for Emily," I replied softly. She gave a small, tight smile and stepped aside. Inside, the house looked the same. Neat, cold, filled with memories that didn't belong to me. David helped Emily take off her coat while I placed the gifts we'd brought near the table. Everything seemed calm for the first hour, but calm never lasts long in that house. I was in the kitchen, helping her set the table. When she said it so quietly, I almost thought I imagined it. "You should have stayed home today." I turned to her. "What do you mean?" She didn't look up. David doesn't need any more problems. He's been so tense since Christmas. Sometimes peace means knowing when to step back. My hands froze over the plates. "Are you asking me not to come here anymore?" She smiled faintly. "I'm just saying, not everyone fits into every family." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the words. It was how calmly she said them, like she was removing a piece from a puzzle that never belonged there. David walked in just then, and she changed her tone instantly. "Oh, Anna was just helping me with the dishes," she said sweetly. I stayed quiet. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to ruin the day for Emily. When it was time to leave, Emily refused to go. "Grandma said I can stay tonight," she said, jumping with excitement. I looked at David. "Did you agree to that?" He hesitated. Mom thought it would be nice. Just one night. I forced a smile for Emily. Okay, sweetheart. Mommy will pick you up tomorrow morning. I kissed her goodnight and walked to the car, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. David stayed behind for a bit. He said he'd help his mom clean up. I drove home alone. When I returned the next morning, the house was silent. I knocked once, twice, no answer. Then I tried the handle. Locked. I called out softly, "Hello, it's Anna." Still nothing. Through the window, I saw Emily eating breakfast with her grandmother. She looked happy, unaware of the tension floating like smoke between the walls. I knocked again, louder this time. My mother-in-law turned, saw me, and instead of opening the door, she simply shook her head and closed the curtain. For a few seconds, I stood frozen. Then I realized she had locked me out. The cold wind stung my face as I stepped back from the door. It wasn't anger I felt. It was disbelief. After years of trying to belong, I was standing outside, like a stranger in my own family's world. I could hear faint laughter from inside Emily's sweet, innocent voice. I smiled weakly through tears. At least she was happy. That's all that mattered. I waited by the car until David finally arrived. He looked surprised to see me standing there. "Why didn't you go in?" he asked. "She didn't let me," I said quietly. He frowned. "Mom, that can't be true." I looked him straight in the eye. "Then ask her." He hesitated, then went inside. 5 minutes passed before he came back out, his face pale. "She said she didn't realize you were outside," he murmured. I smiled sadly. Of course she didn't. And that was the day I stopped knocking on that door. That night, I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, it did. But because something inside me had gone completely still. Like a candle that had burned too long, until the wax finally gave up. David tried to explain. He said his mother didn't mean to, that she wasn't thinking. But I knew better. People always mean it when they do it twice. For days after that, I moved through the house quietly. I spoke softly to Emily, helped her with homework, cooked meals, and kept myself busy. But inside, I was somewhere else entirely. Every time I looked at David, I saw the man I loved and the silence he chose instead of me. It was strange, realizing that love can exist in the same space as disappointment. One evening, while folding laundry, I found his mother's scarf. It smelled faintly of her perfume. That's when I remembered she'd left it in our car after Christmas. I stared at it for a long time, and something inside me whispered, maybe it's time to stop cleaning up after her. I placed the scarf on the table and didn't move it. For days, it stayed there untouched. A quiet reminder of everything I'd endured. David noticed the change. "You've been distant," he said one night. I looked up from my book and replied softly, "Have I?" He sighed. "Anna, I know things are tense right now. But can't we just go back to how it was?" I smiled faintly. "How it was? You mean me pretending everything's fine while your mother decides where I belong?" He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "Please don't make me choose," he whispered. And that was it. The words I had always feared and expected. I stood there for a long time, watching the man who once promised to protect me, now begging not to be uncomfortable. I said quietly, "I never asked you to choose between us. I just wanted you to see me, really see me. Not as the woman who took you away from her, but as the one who loves you enough to stay." He didn't answer. And maybe that silence was the answer. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just rising, painting soft light across the kitchen floor. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat by the window. The house was still, no sound but the ticking clock. And for the first time, that silence didn't scare me. It felt like peace. Emily came down a little later, still sleepy. She climbed into my lap and asked, "Mommy, are you and Daddy mad at each other?" I kissed her forehead. "No, my love," I whispered. "We're just learning how to listen." But deep down, I knew we hadn't learned that at all. We'd only learned how to avoid what hurt. That was the breaking point. Not a fight, not a shout, not a slammed door. Just the quiet realization that the person beside you stopped hearing your heart a long time ago. That night, when David fell asleep, I stood by the window again, watching the snow begin to fall. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. And I made a promise to myself. If love was meant to heal, it should never leave you feeling small. A few days later, while cleaning Emily's room, I found one of her drawings on the floor. It showed a small house, a big sun, and 3 stick figures, me, her, and David. But standing far away, near the edge of the page, was another figure. A taller one, with gray hair and a big smile. She'd written underneath it, "Grandma is watching us." I stared at that drawing for a long time. It felt innocent and pure. Yet it carried the weight of everything I'd been trying to fix. Even my little girl could sense how divided our world had become. That night, after Emily went to bed, I sat down with an old notebook. I didn't plan to write a letter. I just wanted to get the noise out of my head. The things I couldn't say to David. The words that never fit into conversations anymore. I started with, "Dear Margaret," and paused. That was my mother-in-law's name. Even writing it made me hesitate. Then I kept going. "I don't hate you. I never did. You think I took your son away. But truth is, I've been trying to bring him closer to both of us. You built walls around him long before I came. And I've spent years trying to open a door you keep closing." My handwriting trembled. Tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink. But I didn't stop writing. "I wish you could see me not as a threat, but as a woman who loves your child and your granddaughter. You don't have to like me, but I wish you'd at least stop punishing me for loving them." I wrote until my hand ached, and when I was done, I signed my name Anna. I didn't plan to send it. I folded the letter, placed it inside an envelope, and kept it in my drawer. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant for me. A goodbye to all the things I never got to say out loud. The next morning, David left early for work. I stayed home, feeling unusually calm. It was strange, peace without resolution, acceptance without closure. Later that afternoon, while I was out grocery shopping, David called. "Mom's not feeling well," he said. "I'm taking Emily over to see her." I froze for a moment, then simply said, "Okay." I didn't argue, didn't complain. I just let them go. When I got home, something unexpected happened. The drawer where I'd kept the letter was open, and the envelope was gone. At first, I thought maybe Emily had taken it. But when David came home that evening, he looked pale, uneasy. "Did you write something to my mother?" he asked quietly. My heart sank. "You read it." He hesitated, then nodded. "She called me crying. She said she had no idea you felt that way." I didn't know what to say. My private words, the ones I never meant for her to see, had somehow reached the one person I could never talk to. For a moment, I felt exposed, vulnerable, terrified. But then, something unexpected happened. David said softly, "She wants to talk to you." I didn't answer right away. For years, I had dreamed of that sentence. But now that it had come, I didn't know if I still wanted it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat awake, thinking about that letter. How it left me, how it found her. How maybe, somehow, fate had decided to speak for me. And for the first time, I wondered if forgiveness wasn't about fixing things, but about letting go of what's already broken. The next morning, David asked if I wanted to go with him and Emily to visit his mother. My first instinct was to say no. Old memories whispered warnings, the arguments, the silent disapproval. The way she used to look through me, not at me, but something inside me felt different. Maybe it was the letter. Maybe I was just tired of carrying the same pain. So I said quietly, "Yes, I'll come." The drive was silent. Emily hummed softly in the back seat, clutching her small teddy bear. Outside, the sky was gray. the kind of gray that feels like it's holding its breath before a storm. When we arrived, Margaret was sitting in her garden. She looked smaller than I remembered, older too. Her eyes lifted slowly when she saw me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. David excused himself to help his mother's nurse inside. It left just the two of us standing there. Years of unspoken words hanging in the air between us. Margaret finally broke the silence. "I read your letter." My throat tightened. "I didn't mean for you to." "I know," she interrupted softly. Her voice wasn't sharp this time. It was fragile. She reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out the folded pages. "I've read it 3 times. Every word. I didn't know what to say." I just stood there, watching her hands tremble slightly as she held the letter. "I thought you hated me," she whispered. "I thought you were trying to erase me from David's life." I swallowed hard. I never wanted that. She nodded slowly. "I see that now. I guess I was scared. After his father died, I only had David. And when you came, I felt like I was losing him too." Her words hit me like a quiet truth I'd never considered. This woman, who had seemed so cold and distant, she'd just been holding on to her son the only way she knew how. I felt something inside me soften. "Margaret," I said gently, "you never lost him. You just never realized there was enough love to share." She looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw tears in her eyes. We sat together on that old wooden bench. No shouting, no defenses. Just 2 women who had spent too long misunderstanding each other. After a long silence, she reached for my hand. Her skin was thin, warm, trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have tried harder to know you." Tears filled my eyes too. "I'm sorry for giving up on you," I whispered back. At that moment, Emily came running from inside, laughing, holding a small flower. She handed it to her grandmother. "Here, Grandma. Mommy says flowers make people happy." Margaret smiled a real, genuine smile. "And for the first time ever," she said. "Thank you, sweetheart." She looked at me again. She's right. Flowers. And forgiveness. I couldn't help but smile. Something had changed that day, not in words, but in hearts. ... When we drove home, David reached over and squeezed my hand. "She hasn't smiled like that in years," he said quietly. I looked out the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft orange light. It felt like the universe had finally exhaled. As if all the storms we'd weathered had led us right here. That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she asked, "Mommy, is Grandma our friend now?" I kissed her forehead. "Yes, my love. I think she finally is." Emily smiled sleepily. "Good. I told Grandma you just needed a hug." I laughed softly, brushing her hair back. Kids always see the truth before we do. And as I turned off the light, I realized forgiveness doesn't happen when we talk. It happens when we finally start to listen. A few months passed after that day in the garden. Winter slowly melted into spring, and the house began to feel lighter. Not because anything grand had changed, but because something inside us finally had. Margaret started visiting once a week. At first, it was just for tea and short chats. Then, she began bringing small gifts for Emily. A handmade scarf, old storybooks, cookies that smelled like my own childhood. And one afternoon, while we were washing dishes together, she looked at me and said quietly, "I never thought peace could come this late in life." I smiled. Peace doesn't check the clock. We both laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that heals more than words ever could. One Sunday, we decided to host Christmas dinner again. The same night that once broke everything apart. This time, it wasn't about making things perfect. It was just about being together. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey. Emily hung a paper star on the window. Margaret stood beside her, showing her how to fold it neatly. When David walked in, he looked around, almost in disbelief. "Feels different this year," he said softly. "It is," I whispered back. At dinner, Margaret raised her glass and said, To family, the kind that learns, the kind that forgives, and the kind that keeps showing up, no matter how late. There was no grand applause, no dramatic music in the background, just the sound of forks, gentle laughter, and the quiet joy of people who had finally stopped fighting their past. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stood by the window watching the snow fall outside, the same view I'd once watched through tears, now wrapped in peace instead of pain. I thought of everything we'd been through, the misunderstandings, the silence, the years lost to pride, and I realized that forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a slow return home. When I turned, Margaret was standing in the doorway. She looked tired, but her eyes were soft. She walked over, placed her hand on mine, and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I held her hand and smiled. "Thank you for finding your way back." For a long time, we just stood there. To women who had learned, the hard way, that love can survive almost anything if you let it. Years later, when Emily grew up and asked about her grandmother, I told her this story. I told her how sometimes, the people we clash with the most are the ones who teach us the deepest kind of love. She listened quietly, then said, "So love is just forgiving over and over again." I smiled through the memory. Yes, sweetheart. Love is just forgiveness that never gives up. And as I watched her walk out into her own life, I whispered a silent thank you. To Margaret, to time, and to every broken moment that led us here. Because in the end, forgiveness didn't erase the past. It simply made peace with it. And that peace was all I'd ever needed.